There we go. Yeah. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this semester's Irish Studies Research Seminar Series. As usual, we have a hybrid event, so we've got an audience here in the room, we've got an audience of people joining us online through Teams, so you're very welcome, whatever mode you're using. We have an opportunity to engage in question and answer at the end of the presentation today, and that can be done both online and also in person. So without further ado, let me introduce today's visiting speaker, who's Professor Red Washburn. So Red is Professor of English and Women's and Gender Studies at Queen's College at the City University of New York, and affiliate faculty in the Women's and Gender Studies program at the CUNY Graduate Centre. His new book, Irish Women's Prison Writing, Mother Ireland's Rebels, 1960s to 2010s, has recently been published by Routledge. But he's also published widely in journals and in anthologies, including Theory and Praxis, Women's and Gender Studies at Community Colleges, Introduction to Women's, Gender and Sexuality Studies, Interdisciplinary and Intersectional Approaches, and Trans Bodies, Trans Cells, a resource for the transgender community. He's received ACLS Mellon Fellowship for the next project, which is entitled Non-Binary, Transforming Gender and Genre in Non-Binary Literature, Performance and Visual Art. But it's on the Irish Women's Prison Writing Project that Red's going to speak to us today. He's brought his book with us, and he'll be reading an extract from that. But you're going to start, Red, by giving an introduction to what the book is about your methodology, and about kind of principal findings. So,
great. First off, I just want to thank everybody for joining me today in conversation about this book. And I want to thank Dr. Gray for organizing this event, and also to Kathy for helping with the logistics. And I'm really looking forward to a Q&A with everyone. So hopefully folks will want to engage with the work. And I know Susie and I gave a talk with a couple other people recently, so I know a lot of other people are doing the work, so I'd be curious to hear how that's going for folks too. So to begin, I just wanted to start with an overview of the book, and then I thought I would read a little bit from the book itself. So this came out in November. I'm really excited it's out as part of a series that Eugene O'Brien did, who is head at Marian McGlinchey College in Limerick. So there's some really interesting work in that series if people are interested. There's some work on environmentalism and feminism, and then some more canonical works as well. So I would encourage people, if they're interested in that, to check it out. And there's also the American Conference for Irish Studies is also in Limerick this summer, so hopefully some of you will be at that as well. This book came about, I thought I would talk a little bit about how I got interested in the topic. This book came about because at the time I was doing research on civil rights movements in the States, and looking at the connections between feminist movements, civil rights movements, and found out through some of the research I was doing, which is primarily literary and archival, and some interviews, oral histories as well, that there were connections between the US and the Irish social movements for civil rights. And at the time I watched a really wonderful film, and maybe folks have heard of it, and if not, I highly recommend that you check it out if you can find it, called The Road of Women by Melissa Thompson. And she was premiering that film actually when I was in DC. I was working on my PhD at the University of Maryland, and I fell in love with that film. And there's some really rich interview materials. Peter and I were talking about Boston College a second ago, and one of the people who's in this book and who's also in that film, Ella O'Dwyer, taught at Boston College, and there's some really, really wonderful interviews with her in particular. So I watched that film, and through that film, I became even more aware of the connections, the transatlantic connections between the movements. So this project actually started out as my PhD dissertation, which was a comparative project. It was a US and Irish focus. And when I was sending it out to publishers, people were more interested in the Irish component. And I'll just say, I'm from the States, so I understand that there's some limitations to the study in terms of my positionality. So that was an issue for me when I was putting it out there into the world. So that's something I locate in the book, that I'm actually from the States, not Ireland. And then also there's the larger discussion about the divisions in Ireland, in the South and the North. So I acknowledge some of that as well, because some of the writers in this book are from the South and some are from the North. A lot of them are from the North. When I started writing this book, I had in transition, so some of that has shifted in terms of my own gender location as well. And mostly like thinking through class politics was an important part for me too in the book. I grew up very working class, and some of the writers in the study grew up very, very poor working class. Some of them grew up kind of wealthy. So that's something that I acknowledge in the book too. And generally, through getting interested in that work is how this book kind of took off. I ended up writing 2 new content chapters during lockdown. I don't know, we can all talk about what we did during lockdown. But I decided to do some work during lockdown that was more archival focused. And this universe actually helped with, I don't know if you remember, Peter, you and some other folks put me in touch with some PhD students to help get last minute things that I couldn't get during lockdown. So I'm very appreciative for that too. So I ended up doing 2 new content chapters that were on people who are deceased. One was on Dolours Price, and then I had done a number of work in here on Eileen Hickey, but I decided I wanted to add a little bit more. So I was able to get some of that information through research assistance, which was really, really wonderful. So I got into the project because I really wanted to explore civil rights. It became something bigger than it was. I also have a vested interest in Irish politics. So I know it's different growing up in the States, but you know, I come from that lineage. It's something that culturally has been passed down through my great grandparents and my grandparents, and then my parents. Is just something that kind of goes down the line. And obviously it shifts and transforms, but culture has always been very much embedded in my family and in my community. And I think that's often passed down through literature and passed down through music and passed down through food, among other things. So I got interested in the project that way. So the first project was more of a focus on the connections between the civil rights movements in the US, and looking at particularly like connections between Black civil rights and also just like civil rights generally. And then it kind of became more of an Irish focused text later on. And I think it has a different focus now, and I'll talk about that later. And what I try and do in the book, and I should just say this, to start, is my work is very interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary, whatever word you want to use. And Peter and I were just talking about interdisciplinary work, and oftentimes it's scattered in universities, which I think is actually a benefit, and we can talk about that later if it is or it isn't. But my work is specifically focused in women, gender, and sexuality studies. I see that as a very important location. However, I teach in an English department. I teach history classes, I've taught philosophy classes. So I understand the utility of traditional disciplines too, but I always feel very excited when traditional disciplines can be in conversation with one another. And it's not to say they aren't, but I do feel like sometimes they're often jettisoned and siloed in these very kind of direct ways that interdisciplinary work, I feel as if, in my experience, has been very much embracing intellectual contradictions in a way where it transcends those spaces that are very fixed. But, everyone might feel differently about that. I don't know. But so this project is coming out of those locations. It's also coming out of identity politics. and beyond. But what I try to do is a very close reading of literature in the text, and I use archival materials to supplement literary analysis. And I also use oral histories and interviews to supplement that analysis as well. In the cases where I was not able to supplement interviews, such as somebody had passed on or someone was retired from public life, or someone was living abroad in England, or whatever the situation was, I tried to supplement that with more archival material than some of the other chapters. So that's a little bit about my methods, but I will say that in the chapter, what I try to outline is the connections between looking at theory and autobiography and looking at history and autobiography and thinking about the ways in which they all are connected in certain ways, and also looking specifically around like feminism as an everyday practice and looking at social movements as something that are long civil rights movements of sorts, that they're not just, there is a focus on a period and that's really important, but they do have a larger kind of intellectual genealogy and a larger legacy of resistance, if you will, that they are situated in a certain period, but they extend beyond that. So in the introduction, I map out a decolonial feminist aesthetics of sorts that looks at the connections between feminist theory and post-colonial theory, between critical race theory and post-colonial theory, and critical race theory and feminism, and the ways in which they all kind of connect, and looking at how critical race theory in the US, not specifically the US, but like a lot of the critical race theory that was coming out of the US was very important to understanding difference in the context of this book. So looking at things like, you know, what Bernadette Devlin at the time called apartheid without color, and looking at connections in that sense. But looking at critical race theory from this kind of angle of vision that was less about race as like tied to skin color and instead race as a system of power, and post-colonial theory as something that interrogates what a nation looks like when it's decolonized, or what it means to be post-colonial, if that exists, the ways in which a colonized country in any form is really never completely colonized, as much as I believe in kind of an ethos of freedom, that you still carry, like, you know, I'm thinking of like someone like Fanon says, like the psychology of violence, whether it's through culture, or even Said, like the ways in which culture could be tied to cultural colonialism through language or through literature. So I use post-colonial theory to really look at the ways in which these writers in particular look at literature and compose literature in this way that is trying to destabilize colonialism, but also helps contribute to a narrative of the nation. And in some ways that's very gendered. Like, so for instance, I'm going to just say women, but when I'm saying women in this sense, I'm saying like cisgender women are often portrayed as like the biological or cultural reproducers of a nation. And cisgender men are often portrayed as like kind of like in charge of the nation. And I know that's a dualism that's problematic, but I look at that in the book in terms of division of labor in families and in organizational structures. And I do that with the women themselves. So that's a little bit of kind of the theoretical apparatus of the book. So I map out really what does it look like to have that kind of decolonial feminist aesthetic, and also how do we talk about abolitionist feminism? I know that's something that is like very much, you know, a dinner conversation even now around like the movement for Black lives in the States and like general issues around prison politics. So that's something I look at in my conclusion as well, but I look at in the text, like, in what ways can we expand our notion of autobiography or literature to include what I call outlaw genres of sorts? I know that's like borrowing from Barbara Harlow's work, but outlaw genres and gender outlaws are very much a part of this study. So in what ways were these women not subscribing to normative traditional values of sorts? And in what ways was their writing also a way that they could resist what was expected culturally and politically of them? And also, I've been, like I said, located mostly in English departments. So in what ways does the canon uphold a sense of what literature is acceptable and what isn't? So for instance, any kind of like slave narratives, Holocaust narratives, sci-fi, fantasy, prison narratives, they're often seen as kind of like low culture or like not worthy of looking at. I'm not saying everybody, but like when you read the canon, not everybody, when you read the canon, and I'm not knocking Shakespeare, but you're expected to read certain like, you know, quote unquote big writers, and like I have no problem with that, but like, you know, when we look at the canon, I think there's always room to expand it. So some of the folks in this study are like well-known people. So, you know, I talked about Bernadette for a minute, and now I'm like, you know, there's some other, I can go through some of the chapters. So, you know, besides, you know, I talk about Mairéad Farrell. Besides them, I really tried to include a lot of lesser known names. And then I tried to include people who were writers, who identified as a writer in some capacity before they were interned, and people who became writers when they were interned, or people who may not call themselves writers, but who are writing. And I know that's kind of like a whole other thing. It's like, you know, when I hear like graduate students say they're not scholars, and I'm like, but are you doing scholarship? You know, so there's that, you know, it's like, if you're a writer, if you write, you know, my definition, you know, everyone can define themselves however they want. So the first chapter I look at Bernadette McAliskey's The Price of My Soul. And that in that chapter, I look at kind of themes of rhetoric and politics. And I look at kind of this false dualism of like pacifism and self-defense. And I pull in some kind of like transatlantic connections. So like Angela Davis and Martin Luther King and how they complicated those ideas. But for the most part, it's focused on her memoir. I was not able to interview her. She apparently has been declining interviews for decades. But the good news is there's a plethora of work on her that I was able to kind of use that to advance the study. But there is a tremendous amount of archival work in that chapter. And some of it's from People's Democracy and women, you know, the H blocks, the Arma Committee, and then there's Women Against Imperialism. So there's like a lot of different organizational materials in that chapter, but there's also just information about her. And then the next chapter that I look at specific things that had happened during the Troubles. So I look at the No Wash protest, and I look at the hunger strikes, and I look at it through the eyes and through the activism of Eileen Hickey and Mairéad Farrell and Síle Darragh. And that chapter is focused on kind of themes of leadership and comradeship. That chapter is very, very like heavy archives, because two of the people that I look at and whose work I look at have passed on. So, and I'm going to read an excerpt from the chapter on Farrell today. And that research is coming from a number of places, but I got access to her Arma file, and I look at some of the offenses for which she was found guilty. And I look at some of the ways in which she was held responsible for her actions while in prison, and looking at her letters while in prison too. And I know a lot of people have done work on Mairéad Farrell, but what I try to do in this chapter is a little different from what a lot of scholars, like I'm thinking someone like Margaret Ward, who Susie and I saw recently, like her work and many scholars' work is really looking at it like less so as a literary study. And so I'm doing more kind of literary analysis of her work. The next chapter in the text is about Ella O'Dwyer and Martina Anderson. And I spoke earlier about Ella O'Dwyer, but Martina Anderson and Ella O'Dwyer work together. That chapter really looks at the politics and the practice of strip searching in prison as a form of psychological rape. I would even argue perhaps physical rape. That's up for debate. And I look at their writing, which is mostly epistolary, so like letter writing, and the ways in which they were able to use writing as a form of activism. And much of their writing, like the women in Armagh, was smuggled out on International Women's Prisons Day, but also a lot of O'Dwyer and Anderson's writing was sent to larger human rights organizations. So their work is archived in many places, and much of it's actually at the Linden Hall Library, even though they were in prison in England for a while. Their letters really are fascinating because they do this very qualitative study of themselves, of how many times they were strip searched and what does that mean in terms of reproducing power and wealth. But they're also doing this thing in their writing that I think is super fascinating, which is it's about them, but not. It's always about what are people on the outside doing and what ways are they disadvantaging or harming people on the outside by putting the attention on them, which I thought was like kind of a selfless act because people are really invested in helping them. So I look at in their letters, and I do this with Farrell's work too, the number of times they thank people, the number of times they feel a sense of obligation of prioritizing people on the outside over themselves. And obviously I think that's gendered too. Like I'm thinking of like Virginia Woolf's notion of the angel in the house, like this kind of like selfless person. But both of them were very, very inspiring, and like they were spitfires, right? So like they were very radical in terms of their beliefs and in terms of their education, in terms of their writing, and all the things they did even after they were released from prison. But they also had an obligation to the collective, right? They were focused on the collective. So I think in some ways that unpacks this kind of notion of Western individualism in really interesting ways. But I think there is a very significant gendered focus that we could discuss later if you want. But yeah, I mean, and then they went on to do other things. So Martina was still is in politics, and Ella's still writing, and they both did the Open University degrees too. So Ella did a number of projects there, and a book. She wrote a book too that was put out by Pluto, and she almost got a professorship at Boston College, but she wasn't able to take it because of her past. So that's that chapter. And then I go on to a chapter that looks at sisters in prison. So I look at the Price sisters, and I am sure many of you know about the Price sisters. And then I look at the Gillespie sisters. So the Price sisters, I look at the writing they did in prison, but then I also look at Dolours' writing outside, on the outside. So some of the work that she was doing, like around her kind of like independent politics, and looking at her writing from that angle. And then that chapter got also very heavy archival content because Dolours obviously isn't around. So I went through a number of the files at the Q archives. If you're interested, there's some really wonderful materials. It's very painful to read because a lot of it is force feeding, but not exclusively so. And then the Gillespie sisters, who I think this is very interesting. If you don't know about them, you might want to look into this. I think their memoir is out of print, but you might be able to find a copy of it. It's called Sisters in Shackles. And they wrote that memoir together. So as biological sisters, but as sisters in the struggle. And that I specifically put them in the text because I really wanted to have, even though the book I read was translated into English, I wanted to include that in the book because I wanted to include writers who were in England and who were challenging colonialism and language. So that chapter really looks at a number of kind of overlapping themes. So not just force feeding, but this idea of sisterhood and exile. So what does it mean to feel exiled in your own country? And what does it feel to be in exile in another country while you're in prison? And that is mostly a kind of like a juggling of letters and a longer memoir. The second to last content chapter is on Roseleen Walsh's work, and Roseleen's work that I explore in the text is actually poetry. And I did a number of readings with Roseleen recently, and most recently at the Lennon Hall, and Susie was there, as I mentioned. So Susie, Ailish Rooney, Roseleen, and I, we all contributed to a discussion, and Roseleen has since moved from poetry. I mean, she's still writing poetry, but she's also written more than 40 plays. She has a collection called Political Drama, and she's now working on a memoir, and she's about halfway done with it, and it's month by month of her time while she was interned. And she runs a theater company as well in Belfast, Comida Productions. And she's just incredible, the amount of ways that she is creative. So I'm just saying that because she is a very kind of expansive writer and artist, very interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary. But in this chapter, I'm looking at the poetry that she did in prison. And she had a very she had a very visual experience and bodily experience at writing, where she actually took a green marker and wrote on her prison walls. And obviously that activity was contraband at the time, but she was allowed to continue because people were interested in her work and they saw it as art. So it was left alone for like art's sake. And many of those poems she went on to publish later in a connection called Aiming Higher. And her husband passed 2 years ago, and she actually started writing on her walls in her own home, like she did in prison. So this is something that I've been talking about with her, like, what does it mean to be comforted by your words in your space from a place that was really repressive to a place that feels very comfortable. And she also went back to Armagh. This was a few years ago, but she went back to Armagh 40 years later and read a number of pieces in the actual jail that has since been closed. But she went in there with a number of other women who were interned there, and was able to, like, in some ways reclaim the space by going in it from being on the outside, and also kind of speaking truth to power by reading in it. So I thought that was really interesting. And if you go to her website, I think it's just roseleenwalsh.com. It might be .org. If you go on her website, you can see a number of the projects she's working on, but also you can see some of the video. She's doing a lot of documentary projects. You can watch some of the work that she's done on Armagh at 40. And then the last content chapter I'm going to move this along. The last content chapter I did was on Margaretta D'Arcy's memoir, which she calls a collective memoir called Tell Them Everything, which is since out of print, but you can find copies of it. So Margaretta is one of the few people who I think is like, at the time, was a very established writer, and she also did a number of projects with her husband John Arden at the time too. So she was a writer before she was interned, and she was, dare I say, one of the more privileged people who was interned, because it was a voluntary internment, because she defaced an object in public space and refused to pay her fine, and then went to prison, refused to do it on those grounds, but it was a choice because it was not a hefty fine. And she undertakes a project as a person from the South going into the North. So she talks about some of the problems with that outsider status, but she also talks about it in a way that her privilege allows a certain amount of exposure. And in that text, she does a really wonderful job, in particular, of reflecting on the No Wash protests. But I would argue that Síle Darragh's memoir, John Lennon's Dead, is actually more of a kind of first-person insider account of that, because she was an officer in command and she wrote this lengthy memoir and was in there for much longer. So I think the two are complementary, but if you wanted to, you could read Síle Darragh's memoir and get kind of a more thorough understanding of that time. And then just, to go through the conclusion. In the conclusion, what I'm really doing is I'm looking at what does it look like and what does it mean to create an interdisciplinary prison archive? How do we tell stories from an outsider location and keep them center? How do we tell stories in a way where we privilege our own voice and our own history rather than someone else writing it? How do we create an intersectional abolitionist feminism that at its core doesn't see one identity as more important than another, or one feminism as more important than another? And how do we talk about prison studies in a way that, really interrogates social injustice? And so I'll leave that as it is with the overview. And then I thought I could turn to a section of the text that looks at close reading and archival materials on Mairéad Farrell. So I'm going to turn to that now, and it's in this, but I shortened it, so I'm going to just read from up here. So to begin, in 1986, Mairéad Farrell said, "I'm oppressed as a woman. I'm also oppressed as an Irish person. Everybody in this country is oppressed, and yet we can only end oppression as women if we end the oppression of our nation as a whole." This talk is going to explore important intersections of feminism and republicanism in Ireland through the pen and the eyes of prison leader Mairéad Farrell. I focus on themes of comradeship and leadership in her writing about her time in Armagh Jail. I turn to thematic and stylistic analyses of her writing, which includes letters, statements, petitions, tributes, and speeches. I discuss various historical themes, including special category status, Black February, and the No Wash protests, also known as the Dirt Strikes, as well as the 1980 hunger strike. I analyze her writing as a collective action, including humor, irony, shout-outs, roll calls, thank yous, and allusions. Overall, I argue that her writing is a form of resistance and that her voice shows a different view of history, struggle, and canon. As she puts it, the intent was for them to live where they all have an equal say in a non-sexist Gaelic society. So at this point, I'm turning to thematic and stylistic analyses of leadership and comradeship in her writing. In prison, Mairéad Farrell, as stated earlier, was officer in command of Republican prisoners. She divided her time between studying for an open university degree, teaching feminism and language classes, and organizing protests, the latter of which she gave primacy. And I'll just say this real fast. This is really important because to be an officer in command in Armagh meant that the political prisoners were creating their own structure within a prison. So Mairéad Farrell was very much the leader of that. So she held a certain degree of power from a powerless location. Through a Freedom of Information Act request that I gained, I was able to access her robust and very robust Armagh prison file at Her Majesty's prison. This file provides a really good character sketch of her political activities as a senior leader in the IRA while in prison. And I would encourage you all, if you're interested, to look at it, because there's a lot more than I can say today. In the file, it's very clear she refuses to accept criminal status. She resists a number of prison rules, including organizing political prisoners. And I'm going to talk about some of the other ones as well. Obtained through this request, I was able to look at a number of activities for which Farrell was reprimanded, and in particular, the rules for which she was guilty included Rules 30 and 31. From December of 1976 to June 1980, for instance, Farrell's political offenses are consistent: refusing to work, which was 88 offenses, entering cells, 41, conducting parades or marches, 8, issuing commands, 6, threatening officers, 5, conducting drills, 2, among other minor charges of destroying prison property. And again, this is from the prison file at Her Majesty's Armagh prison. From December of 1980 to March of 1983, Farrell's charges remain constant following a similar pattern: refusing to work, 35, disobeying orders, 15, conducting parades, 7, issuing commands, 3, threatening officers, 6, among other minor charges of refusing to be searched, 1, and obstructing a cell door, 1. Out of these charges, she was punished for holding memorial services for fallen volunteers, wearing black armbands and clothes from garbage bins the most. In addition, she was charged with speaking in English, calling out words of command, teaching Irish politics, history, culture, and gender studies, using threatening language was the charge. Defending her quote-unquote girls from what they called screw abuse, such as starvation, assault, and theft. And these were also included during religious services, among others. Serious punitive consequences resulted from these charges, such as refusing to work. The charge carried 28 days, loss of remission, a forfeit of 2 privileged visits, all privileged parcels, and all privileged association. More often than not, Farrell refused to participate in any prison procedure whatsoever. As she puts it, "I am a political prisoner," I'm quoting here, "and I demand to be treated as such. The charge which I've been found guilty of was politically motivated, regardless of the date it took place. Whether you wish to recognize this fact or not, I never respond to the label of criminal." She was classified as a first-rate troublemaker. Her rebellious spirit was unrelenting in terms of both the struggle itself and how she voiced it in her work, including in her writing, her smuggled letters, also known as comms. Republican women prisoners wrote in prison to keep their spirits alive, communicate with loved ones, and communicate with comrades in the struggle. They work with churches, unions, youth groups, and other solidarity committees. Oftentimes, they wrote letters, statements, poems, and smuggled letters to send to Republicans on the outside. These comms were contraband. They were smuggled out, with many of them being left in prison, or many of them were left the prison on International Women's Day. They were written on toilet paper and cigarette papers. Much of the prison archives have been made possible from having written accounts along with oral histories and film projects. And as an aside, a really great anthology, if you want to read some of the works that have since been collected, is an anthology called In the Footsteps of Anne that started with Eileen Hickey as the main publisher, and she passed on in her friends followed up and completed the project, and there are a number of them, Patterson and Jackson and a number of them who did that anthology. So you can get a hold of that if you want to read some of the women's stories that have since been put into print. In Farrell's letters, most of the attention is on lack of medical attention and torture in prison. Severe problems arise from solitary confinement in particular. Farrell and other political prisoners experienced these for 23 hours a day during much of her prison time. So solitary confinement was all but 1 hour a day. And they had 1 hour that they could go out and exercise in the bitter cold oftentimes. Farrell suffered from numerous infections, including vaginal, pelvic, and kidney. Her refusal to serve labor duties and be strip searched resulted in solitary confinement and deprivation of bathing privileges. So I spoke earlier about strip searches. So Farrell refused to do any of those, and this was how she was punished. So this was a very, very invasive practice, and for many political prisoners who were women, they found it was a direct violation to their modesty and their religion. So many of them had to go through with it, but Mairéad Farrell refused to do it, which meant that she was in solitary. The infection rate reached its apex during the No Wash protest, during which time Farrell and other political prisoners had no access to showers and bathrooms and covered her walls with blood, shit, and piss. And I'm sorry if anyone just ate. And I'll just say that sanitary products too were very inadequate. So what they would do is they would just kind of throw them in the cells without any kind of wrapping. So they would land in the dirt and the shit and all of that. So they couldn't use them. And if they did, they got infections. And they were only allowed three items of sanitary protection per month anyway. So it wasn't enough for them. And much of this information is not just at Linen Hall, but is also in Women's News. Farrell states, sanitary towels are thrown into our cells without any wrapping. We are not permitted paper bags or the like, so they just lie in the dirt unused. State violence on the body and then self-harm on her body from protest, including hunger strikes as well as protests against that state violence, was a form of state violence and gender resistance to state violence, as well as expressive of cultural citizenship, affirming her memories and her body through her writing. Physical assault by law enforcement is used as another form of containment against political prisoners. The report, Beating Women in Prison, provides a comprehensive documentation of Black February. On February 7, 1980, more than 70 prison officers donning riot gear, including shields and batons, entered the B Wing. They targeted the 32 Republican women prisoners in an attempt to find Black clothes worn by women who supported the IRA and Sinn Féin. Farrell, in particular, recaps the horrific episode that ensued between the prison guards and the political prisoners as follows, and I'm quoting here. They beat and dragged the girls to the guard room to be body searched, twisting their arms and pulling their hair. They showed no regard for the fact that their jumpers and their skirts were pulled up around them and they were nearly naked. The girls were then starved of food and drink. Male officers toured the wing for 2 days. The toilets were locked and the girls were not allowed to the toilets. To a great extent, the prisoners were forced into their present situation, hence the no wash, and the beatings continued for a few days. This violence, I argue, represents a violation of the UN standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners. Regulation 31 of that violation of the law states that bodily punishment by placing in a dark cell, and all cruel, inhumane, or degrading punishments shall be completely prohibited as punishments for disciplinary offenses. As the priest states, if this is put forward as normal practice in Her Majesty's prison, then the imagination cannot grasp the principles of bigotry and injustice and denial of fair play that lie beyond the administration of the prison at every level. Nevertheless, the prison authorities, the prison guards, and the riot squad continue this violence for a week with impunity. It was a form of containment for their commitment to resistance against power. Mairéad Farrell experienced and documents the heinous acts of violence she and other political prisoners experienced during Black February. In a letter to her parents written on February 7, 1980, she gives an overview of Black February as follows, and I'm quoting here. On Thursday, February 7th, at approximately 12:15, 40 male officers ran into the wing and surrounded the girls. Then about 30 female officers joined them. The prison authorities then informed me that there was to be a general raid. Nobody was allowed to their cells, and everyone had to go into a single association cells. The male officers never gave us a chance. They immediately jumped us and started beating us all around. After all, we were relatively calm, but we managed to get into the cells. We were split up into the association cells. We stayed there for hours. We had no dinner, and we were allowed nothing to drink. We remained there while male and female officers searched our cells, which were wrecked after the search. We were not allowed to exercise, nor to go to the toilet, or to get washed. We were locked down 24 hours and allowed nothing to eat or drink. Subsequent correspondence with Mairéad Farrell's father the same day and her writings detail the horrific physical abuse she endured. She writes, and I'm quoting, "I was surrounded by 9 to 12 female officers. They had me up against the door, kicking and punching me the whole time. Some of them grabbed my legs and arms, twisting my arms backwards. Another couple were hanging onto my hair while officers carried me down the wing. Other officers pulled my hair in the opposite direction. Eventually, they threw me into an empty cell. A few of them then came after me and were kicking at me, but then ran out and closed the door. Eventually, the medical staff noted Farrell's bruises and tended to her cuts on her left arm, but refused to believe that the quote-unquote bald patch on her head was from the encounter. This incident reflects outrageous violations in power in order to contain resistance. It shows political prisoners were, in Farrell's letter, smuggled out on International Women's Day in a meta situation of sorts, many prisons within a prison, exacerbated and segregated as Republicans." And again, this whole offense was because there was supposedly some contraband Black clothing. Irish Republican women prisoners commenced the No Wash protest, also known as the Dirt Strikes or the Dirty Protest, under duress as a harm reduction response to the events of Black February. Political prisoners fought relentlessly for the reinstatement of special category status, which was implemented in 1972 and later revoked in March of 1976 to obscure political reasons for imprisonment. As a result, they lost many rights such as education, recreation, remission, visitation, and parcels. Food and letters were granted once per month. In addition, they were put into solitary confinement for 23 hours a day, again, including no access to their prayer books or their rosary beads. In a petition, the parents speak addressed to the Armagh prison authorities. Relatives of the prisoners expressed their solidarity in the following passage, and I'm quoting from this letter. "We, the parents and the relatives of the protesting girls in Armagh prison, have agreed to support the prisoners in their protest. Firstly, against the beatings by male officers on February 7, 1980, now known as Black February, and the subsequent denial of access to toilets, February 7 to the 12th, denial of laundry and visits from concerned persons in that period, and secondly, against the 23-hour lockup for refusal to work. This latter punishment is cruel and degrading." Like the Republican men in Longcash, the women received unwavering support, not just from loved ones, but from political organizations and community members for this protest. Mairéad Farrell explains the organic progression from Black February to Dirt Strikes as officer in command of the Republican section of Armagh in her writing during this bleak period. On February 8, 1980, Farrell explains his voluntary participation in a letter. She says, quote, "We have been forced into a position of dirt strikes as our pots are overflowing with urine and excrement. We have emptied them out of the spy holes into the wing. The male officers nailed them closed, but we broke them off using our chairs. Economical solutions to the No Wash protest became reduced to quote unquote decoration." Farrell writes in another letter, "Our walls are covered in excrement. There was nothing else to do with it. You can't pile it up in the corner. That would be unbearable." This way, it's not half as bad. It dries and the smell isn't so bad after an hour or so. The urine is the worst smell. You'll probably find it hard to believe, but the stench of it just seems to cling to the air. Furthermore, she writes in another letter, the stench of urine and excrement cling to the cells in our bodies. Menstrual blood, too, was smeared on the walls, making headlines instantly for its gendered markers of the No Wash protest. For instance, on August 22nd, 1980, Nell McCafferty, a journalist, wrote in the Irish Times, "There is menstrual blood on the walls of Armagh in Northern Ireland. The 32 women on the dirt strike there have not washed their bodies since February 8th, 1980. They use their cells as toilets. For more than 200 days now, they have lived amid their own excrement, urine, and blood." The only relief from the rancid odor was an hour outside every day, the only time they were permitted to exit their cells. Farrell writes in another letter, "We're freezing by the time the hour has passed, but it's worth it. Rain, hail, or snow, we're out in it. Believe me, that fresh air is worth catching pneumonia from." The more than 30 Republican women on this protest were denied basic human rights to hygiene for security reasons. Deemed unsuccessful by the European Commission of Human Rights, for the men in Long Kesh, the dirty protests escalated into hunger strikes that were spearheaded by Bobby Sands and the H blocks after just a year. Farrell's leadership role, devotion to the struggle, and solidarity with prisoners was unwavering. As she puts it in a poem, "Will You?" she writes, "I'm on protest in Armagh, alone with my thoughts tonight, thinking of my brave comrades who won't give up this fight. They give me the strength and determination to see this struggle through, and besides them, I will take my stand." Starvation in the form of hunger strikes is another common thread in the lives of political prisoners in Ireland. Mairéad Farrell's hunger strike for political status, along with longtimers Mairead Nugent and Mary Doyle, was covered exhaustively by the mainstream press. Tired of the British government's inflexible quote-unquote criminalization policy, they demanded the right to refuse work, to organize for educational and recreational facilities, to have one weekly visit, parcel, and letter, and to associate with other political prisoners. People's Democracy got involved with the National H Block Armagh Committee. The statement they put out, "Armagh hunger strike, the central issue for Irish women," helped them gain public attention. And I'm quoting from the statement, "The Armagh hunger strikers and their sisters on political status are not fanatics prepared to die for an abstract principle, nor are they selfish quote-unquote criminals who are making a calculated and cynical bid to the quote-unquote elite treatment from the prison regime. They are ordinary working class women who are in prison because they and thousands of other women in the Catholic ghettos of the north of Ireland realize that the only hope for any real and permanent improvement in the quality of their lives requires nothing less than dismantling the six-county state. They are prepared to die on hunger strike in a final effort to win political status because they understand that it is the political status issue which has become the most important point of confrontation between the forces of imperialism and the nationalist population of Ireland." The hunger strike at Armagh started on December 1st, 1980, the day after they met with their families to break the news. They were referred to as quote-unquote girl terrorists in a concerted effort to infantilize and criminalize them. And these are several articles in Irish presses calling them girl terrorists. Farrell, serving as the spokeswoman, told the press, quote, "The cause of Irish freedom is not a criminal cause, but a political cause, and in order to assert this, we are going on hunger strike, and we are prepared to fast to the death if necessary." After 19 days, it ended abruptly with much miscommunication and violence from the British authorities. Farrell, Nugent, and Doyle pledged their solidarity to the men in Long Kesh who started the hunger strikes earlier. The British government never held up their bargain. As Farrell puts it in a letter, "I know who the real criminals are. The women did not join the men for the second hunger strike, but they continue to support them." Using humor, Farrell was hopeful for change. As she puts it, "Perhaps it will be cornflakes tomorrow. Yes, maybe tomorrow will be our lucky day." Almost 40 years later, it's essential to remember the contributions that Farrell and other political prisoners made and how they shaped the struggle through their stories about it. Farrell uses many stylistic techniques, namely metaphors of solidarity in her prose. Specifically, she explores the other side of prison, what I'm calling repression, in interesting and powerful ways. In many of her letters, she explores these themes and she explores metaphors in her writing. Farrell writes, quote, "This is, in fact, not a prison, but many prisons within a prison. The new prison regime has resorted to the familiar tactic of divide and conquer in every aspect of the prison routine. The separation between A, B, and C wings troubles Farrell, for she is unable to establish bonds with prisoners outside of her wing. Regular association with prisoners was necessary for her as officer in command. Oftentimes, Farrell's political dialogues occurred during religious, educational, and association services. And I'll just say this as an aside. It's been really interesting to see what women have been doing in religious organizations and organizational structures, because it often provides them privacy. Not exclusively so, but I think it's interesting that this was part of Farrell's political work as well. So Farrell writes in another letter, "Every night at 9 p.m. we have the Rosary in Irish. One shouts it down the door and the rest respond. Afterwards, we have our Irish class shouted down the doors. Our voices are good and strong from persisting shouting. Then perhaps we have bingo or we make cards. It's good crack. At 11 p.m., the ghost story is continued from the night before. As we lie in our beds under our covers to keep warm, and we listen to the story. At midnight, all noise ceases and order laid down by our own staff. I get into bed under the blanket, no sheets or pillowcases. Those two were taken by the screws, and think another day has gone. Sinead voices my thoughts. Perhaps it'll be cornflakes tomorrow. Yes, maybe tomorrow will be our lucky day." This passage is packed with visual and sonic images. It shows the activities as good crack for her and the women. It documents intimacy between political prisoners in a place characterized by dehumanization. It shouts comradeship, community, and survival. It's a good illustration of solidarity's warmth beyond abstract rhetoric. In addition, Farrell checked in with political prisoners every night, even if it was just saying, "You all right, girls?" As a result, she was charged with giving orders to prisoners under Rules 30 and 31, received 14 days loss of remission, 14 days loss of privileges, 7 days loss of evening association, and 2 privilege visits. In her piece called "The Arma Song," she writes, "The comradeship never falters and the confidence never wanes. We will know the torture will never alter, yet our sisterhood numbs the pain." Farrell's life, including her prison life and writing, were committed to issues of political harmony and solidarity. Her leadership and her writing about it is a testament to her spirit and her spirit of freedom. She gives shout outs to political prisoners. She bears witness to political prisoners who survived Black February, including Anne Marie Quinn, Ann Bateson, Shirley Devlin, Ellis O'Connor, Eileen Morgan, and Lynn O'Connell, among many others, as a form of stylistic comradeship. And to conclude, the main focus of this chapter is really focused on the connections between the officers of command. So Mairéad Farrell, Eileen Hickey, and Síle Darragh. But for the purpose of this particular part of the chapter, I argue that Mairéad Farrell emphasizes political urgency by knowing our own history, resisting power, and fighting for Irish freedom in her life and work. Her writing is a testament to the power of women's resistance, and her words demonstrate that the revolution was stylized. Her words shaped the struggle in captivating ways, just as much as her involvement was central to it. And again, I just want to thank everyone for coming out today. And if you want to follow my work, you can just go to my website, which is redwashburn.com, or just look me up in the City University of New York system. I'm at Queens College, and I also teach at the Grad Center. But I want to thank Peter and the Institute for Irish Studies for hosting this talk. I'm really happy to be here and to be in conversation with everyone. So thank you.
Red, thank you very much for your presentation and for introducing the book to us. It's very difficult topics, obviously, raised. in the presentation. Very difficult topics in our past here brought out by that. Let's open it up for questions. So obviously, people in the room, just raise your hand if you want to ask a question. People online, either type a question into the comment box or raise your hand, and Luke will give you the opportunity to speak. So, who would like to start? Sue?
Sorry, just I'll ask you, but I think I'm wondering about your definitions of like gendered violence and how you, well, A, how you think about what gendered violence is, and B, how did the women think about that, either in the writing or in the reviews? So is it violence that's done because of the gender, or is it how violence is experienced? And then also, did any of the women, or did you come across any writing about women as perpetrators, like female prison officers? Does their gender come up as like perpetrators of violence as well? Sorry, it's quite convoluted. But
No, I appreciate the question. So I mean, I think there's several parts to your question. So one is gendered violence. I can't really speak for all political prisoners, obviously, but I think my understanding from being in conversation with them and also exploring their work, gendered violence for them oftentimes was violence done to their bodies that they saw was sexualized. It doesn't have to be sexualized, but ways in which they were not allowed their own bodily autonomy. So obviously strip searching was the biggest. And I think, their experience during the dirty protest was, I'm not saying all women menstruate, but like I think for many of them that was their experience, and it affected their sense of feeling in their bodies because they felt so dirty and they had so many infections from not having the care that they needed and access to medical supplies and sanitary products. Like for instance, a lot of the women I spoke to, sorry, I feel like it's like a lot of detailed information, had yeast infections and they had UTIs. So as you know, if they are not treated, particular UTIs, they get bad very quickly. So a lot of them spoke about those experiences. And then they also talked about not being able to, like, in general, like, dress without people looking at them. So it wasn't just like the kind of invasive practice of strip searching, but also just being naked in front of prison officers. And many of them also talked about how it wasn't just a gendered experience, but it was also like very much a cultural and religious experience because they just felt like it was immoral. So that's like one example. And there are many, like another type of gendered violence that I don't think is specifically using the body as a site of location, but could, is motherhood. So some of the women were mothers before they were interned, or I'll just say generally parents. But, some of them had kids in prison. So for them, that was a very gendered form of violence because they felt, understandably so, like very detached from their own families and their own babies.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that is everyone's experience of gender, or that all women have to be parents, but like I think that was a very prominent theme when I was talking to women who had kids either before they were in prison or while they were in prison. And then your other question about female prison guards, there definitely was this one interview I had where one person was talking about just how vicious the prison guard was and how it was a kind of, I don't know how the person put it, a very gendered experience because the particular guard had an experience where she almost resorted to misogynistic tactics to contain the prisoners, even though like womanhood is not removed from other gendered forms of violence, but there was like a shock value attached to that. And then also, I'm just going to say this, there were like very blatant examples of homophobia that came out in the Gillespie sisters memoir that I felt deeply uncomfortable with. And I think those were also very gendered at its core, and I think very sexualized at its core, because I don't really understand if they're not lesbians, then why do they care if there were lesbians in prison? Like, I don't get it, but I think that, like, I'll just say from my political perspective, I think that gendered violence, you know, like there's this assumption that power relations make gendered violence, men reproduce violence onto women, but I'm not saying you're saying this, but any kind of violence is inherently like political, and that, you know, I've witnessed this. It doesn't have to just be this kind of like site of marginal, of like being a gender minority to experience gendered violence.
Yeah.
And we see this a lot, particularly in like lesbian queer communities, you know, or we see this with like women enacting violence on other women generally, regardless of their sexuality. So I think gender, like violence is violence and power is power, and that gender can be a part of it, but it doesn't have to be.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that. I just had a question, I suppose, in terms of the stylized nature of the writings.
Yeah.
I suppose what I was wondering, as someone I suppose reflects on Republican writing from an earlier period, and to what extent are they responding particularly to that male Republican prisoner tradition? Is there a sense of them, I suppose, adhering to that tradition? Do they thwart it? And if that has an influence, to what extent do they minimize the gendered aspect of their experience, which isn't dominant, I suppose, in the Republican prison writing tradition in general?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Thank you so much for putting it out there. And I would love to circle back at some point, because you said you did earlier work on this. So I'd love to hear your understanding of it too, if you want to share. But I think there's a really valid point in terms of the ways in which there is, you know, kind of like a shared commitment to republicanism that's beyond gender, even though I think everything has kind of like gendered and sexualized and racialized components. So I think for my study, many of the women, their feminism was first republicanism, right? So that was their main focus. And then they did kind of a challenging of patriarchal norms, but that was ancillary to this kind of vision for Republican activism and republicanism. So, and I mean, there's been a lot of work done on this, not just in the States, but even in Irish feminist theory around like who gets to determine what's feminist theory, what themes are important, or what vision's important. So I think that, like, you know, one conversation that I have with some of my like introduction to women and gender studies students is that when people think of feminism, they think it's just about reproductive rights, and I'm not saying it shouldn't be. But there's a whole host of other topics that are connected to feminism, and some of them might be war, some of them might be colonialism, but some of them might be welfare. They might be a bunch of environmental stuff, who knows? So I think in this experience, it was definitely the women were kind of upholding a Republican agenda and like comradeship with the men, in particular in Wankesh. But I also think that it became really important, and it behooved them to question that sense of like a national comradeship or Republican comradeship, because they felt discriminated within that Republican community. And you know, I know Jerry Adams wrote a book on women in prison recently, and a number of women spoke out, particularly Margaretta D'Arcy, but a number of women told me this about how Sinn Féin took a very long time to address women's plight in prison. So I think that is definitely an issue that many of the women had, which is that they felt like they were doing their work, but also not receiving any support and any just like any attention on their own kind of location as women. So I think it's complicated. So it's like their feminism is their republicanism, but their feminism was also expanded because of their Republican situation in the presidency. But I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm curious in your writing what comes up and your research what comes up, because I think it goes beyond just the Troubles. I think it's part of a longer kind of anti-imperial project.
Yeah, I was wondering in your work, did the suffering that the women went through in prison and frankly their leadership in the Republican community, did that knock down some gender barriers and enhance the role of women?
Yeah, I think there's multiple ways to view it, but like Women Against Imperialism started during, well, not just started, but like became more prominent because of the Republican women who were in prisons. So I think it did enhance it. And I think that some of it, this is somewhat analogous, but it's kind of tricky to make this connection. But to like women, during World War II who went into the factories and then like they didn't want to have like traditional gender norms, or they didn't want to have like this like work from home situation. And I know like that's racialized and class and all the things. And like people like bell hooks have written about this. But I think what you're saying is really important, because I think it did, because they were put in a situation where their doors were being knocked down and they were soldiers coming into their homes, and then they were put in prisons, and then they were in prisons away from their families, and they were away from their children. Not that all of them had children, but most of them did. And they were away from everything. They had this community of support around like questioning patriarchy. And particularly Mairéad's classes on feminism and Irish classes, and they had a different type of education on political exposure. And for many of them, they continued that work on the outside, so I think some like Margaretta D'Arcy went in to create like pirate radio, which was very feminist at its core, but very anti-imperial, very anti-imperialist. And then, Martina Anderson, has done a lot of work, not just for like United Ireland, but for like feminist and LGBT rights. So I think it like each person's different, but I think to answer your question, I think it did politicize women differently, and I think it did raise awareness within kind of a mainstream Republican movement, or even people who weren't Republican, just people who were aware of politics. I think it expanded their notion of like what women's role is, and that it's not necessarily a monolith.
Any questions on the line?
Yeah, a couple. There's one from Eddie Malloy. He's got his hand raised if he wants to speak. Sure.
Hello, yes, sorry. My dog was climbing up there. Thank you very much, Red, and good to see you, Peter. Fascinating talk, and really look forward to reading the book. A couple of sort of questions, queries, points. Firstly, I'm just wondering, to what extent do you think the women's writing, prison writing in particular, that you've encountered relates to or doesn't relate to earlier sort of iterations of prison writing? There's a very long tradition of Republican prison writing going at least as far back as John Mitchell, and then later on you have it with Ernie O'Malley later on in the 1920s, but also figures like Dorothy McArdle. And I think I was reminded of Dorothy McArdle whenever you mentioned the ghost stories being told, and looking at Earthbound and the Unseen and all these other iterations. And I think Earthbound in particular was sort of partly based on her experience of being in Mountjoy and the storytelling went on then. And the other point I wanted to ask was slightly sort of more methodological point, perhaps. Just because I know you're taking an intersectional sort of methodology as an approach. I also wondered to the extent to which you sort of uncovered perhaps hidden hierarchies of political objectives, in terms of, does the nation come first sometimes? Is feminism very much a secondary ideology for certain participants, if not for others? And how do you sort of deal with that sort of potential contradiction between consciousness and method?
Thank you for these questions. The second question, it kind of went out for a second, but I think I got the gist of it. So the first part, I think, is, I mean, you say it very eloquently, which is that there is a long tradition of writing by and about, you know, prison experiences. And, I was just thinking recently about Countess Markovich and some of the writing that she did. And there's a long tradition with the suffragettes and hunger strikers earlier on. And you could go beyond that. I mean, like, you could even just talk generally, like, in a post-colonial framework, there's so much work that's been done around prison writing. I'm thinking of, I'm not sure if it's still in print, but there is a really wonderful anthology called Wall Tappings. That's an international anthology of women's prison writing. I highly recommend if people want to check that out. And, thinking about, like, there's a whole host of prison narratives by women in South Africa. I think I'm trying to remember the name of it. It's got snake in it. I'll come back to it. I think it's called, like, A Snake in Ice Water. And then, I'm trying to think. Rhodessa Jones, who's in the States. She's a Black woman who's been really focusing on connections between race and gender in prison systems in the States. Has done a lot of theatrical work using women in prison's own experiences as kind of center, and not just writing, but theater and bodies and movement. And she's done a couple of different projects, and I would say, like, the most famous project is a project called the Medea Project. And I think she also had a documentary, I think it's called We Just Telling Stories. But, there's just so much out there. But I'm even thinking about, like, a documentary that came out in the night. Many of them, they're Black lesbians who were out celebrating Pride from New Jersey, and they ended up going to prison because a man came at them trying to stab them, and they went to prison because they tried to defend their lives. And there's been a lot of writing about that experience as well. But yeah, I mean, I think that, and we see, everything that's going on in the world now with all kinds of, colonial projects, like, even just like when the second war in Iraq was happening, Riverbend's books, I think you could even argue that those were a form of, like, prison narrative, because she was kind of imprisoned in her home. So you could think, okay, yes, there's prison narratives, and there's also just general themes of feeling imprisoned in life. And I think you could think about, what does it need to be housed down to as part of that? But there's a lot, and I think there is a long tradition of it, and it's going to keep continuing, and it is. So, I think that what it illustrates is that writing is and will continue to be a form of cultural protest and cultural citizenship for people who don't have access to rights on the outside. The second question, I think, was around consciousness and methodology, or modes of inquiry. And I mean, I can only speak for my own location, and I'm saying this in the process of trying to, right before this talk, work on my research methods syllabus for my graduate students. So I think something at my core as an interdisciplinary person is to always think about knowledge production. Whose voices are included, whose voices aren't included? How is knowledge not just produced, but like how is it received in the world? And thinking about like how do we put different ideas in discussion with other ideas, whether it's through a disciplinary framework, through identity politics, through kind of like just really general questions about gender and the spectrum of difference. So I think that political and social consciousness is embedded in any kind of discipline or any kind of ideology or any kind of idea in general. And I think oftentimes from my experience, the more political work is deemed political, where apolitical work is seen as not political. And I don't think that's necessarily something that is true. So I think like, you know, within like feminist and, you know, queer studies, there's a, you know, a very intentional focus on social consciousness and political consciousness is like steeped in the foundation of knowledge production. And many interdisciplinary programs, like at the time, women's studies and Black studies, and you know, at the time, Latino studies, Native American studies, and obviously there's different variations now, different terms, whether it's gender studies or Latinx studies or, you know, whatever the terminology is now. Just like any kind of area studies based work is already politicized because it's coming out of social movements, right? So I think the only thing that I would point out is that there's like a political intentionality with interdisciplinary work that focuses on social justice at its core, that in many ways other departments it could be in, but it's not its foundation.
Thank you. Do we have another online question?
Yeah. We have two questions. The first one, these are both from Christina Diamond. She says, thank you so much for your presentation. It's interesting to see how political prisoners rejected as contaminants that endangered the body politic had to use bodily waste to lay bare how unacceptable their conditions were. How do you interpret the discrepancy between how often people speak of the men's blanket protest and the relative silence on the women's prison protest? And then she goes, additionally, how would you compare the treatment of female prisoners after the Troubles to the treatment of Command and Bon volunteers in Deb's Free State? What lessons can we learn to promote more political solidarity?
Okay. So the first question was about body politic.
Yeah, and
Okay.
the discrepancy between the men's blanket protest and
Okay.
the silence on women's.
I mean, I thank you for this question. I think there's a number of really good questions within it. I mean, it's really frustrating for me to continue to do this work and still come up with this question about why certain voices aren't heard. I guess the discrepancy for me is really just about what are the gains of feminism and what are the ways that feminism still needs to be amplified. And I think like, you know, in the States, like, and not just in the States, but like the Me Too movement raised consciousness about, you know, the body politic in ways that I think are like hyper visible internationally. And I know that there's, for instance, like a lot of rape happening in South Africa and a number of different like gender-based violence episodes happening in war zones right now. You know, there's a lot happening right now. So I think these are like discussions that will continue. But I think that it is frustrating at this point that there's still not a tremendous amount of scholarship. There's a lot more than there was, but I think that there needs to be a lot more general discussion, not just in the academy, but on the outside, in activist movements. And I'm always conscious, even at like protests, like, you know, there's been protests that have been happening here and elsewhere, whether it's been, you know, like whatever it is, like, you know, like in the US, there was like a lot of big protests happening with Ukraine, for instance, right? Like, even like, why do people talk about certain things and not other things, you know? So, you know, I think that with every protest that I go to, or any lecture that I go to, or any book that I read, I'm always looking at, okay, how many of these authors are from this location? How many of them are from this location? What's left out in between? So I think that's a really important point. And I think that it's still a problem. The second question, I think, I answered it a little bit already, but I think, I think there is a long tradition of Republican women's writing and Republican women's resistance that goes back to, 1916, even before, but specifically 1916. I think really the difference is that because of some of the the points I was raising about feminist archiving, that we have access to more stories in the contemporary moment than we did in the past. And I think that will always be true, probably. I think the art I don't want to say always, but potentially could be true, especially as we find more ways to use technology to archive with more ease and quickness. And yeah, so I think that will always be the case. I think this is just me saying this, I'm not quoting him. I think every generation will find easier ways to archive than in the past. So I'll just leave it at that.
Take one last question.
I was just wondering, Mairéad Farrell, who you said she studied for the Open University while in prison, and how, did she, in her writings, did she ever consider her education from the Open University to be another apparatus of colonialism, even though the Open University was meant to sort of widen education, but so was Queen's when it was established by Queen Victoria, universities are another colonial instrument. And I was wondering if did she have cognizance of that? Because, the Catholic sort of community has always been striving for higher education, but there's a stream of colonial undertones under that I think have been missed by movements just for to progress. I was just wondering if she had any sort of thoughts about her the education for the Open University that she was getting in her writings.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question and your points, particularly here. And I think it's true anywhere, honestly. Education, obviously, I'm saying this as an educator. I'm probably in a room with a number of educators. It's wonderful, but it's not removed from politics. And many of my colleagues have been talking about how to decolonize the syllabus, and it's really hard to do if you're in a position of power. Even as someone who is giving grades, I'm in a position of power, right? So I think that I don't know the direct answer to that, because I wasn't able to ask her, but I'm sure that she probably enjoyed learning, but probably had questions about in what ways her education was impacted by these other larger colonial endeavors within the academy. And I know that for instance, Ella Dwyer got her PhD in prison. Martina got her bachelor's in prison. And from talking to them, they really benefited from their studies, but their work was very political. And I don't know the direct answer to that part of it, but I will say that I think that they were probably aware that there were limitations to what they could do, but they still reap the benefits of it. But in the documentary Mother Ireland, Get Off Our Backs, there's a clip of Marie talking about prisons, and I don't think it's specifically about education, but there is a component about learning, and you might be able to find some more information there.
What's the documentary?
Mother Ireland, Get Off Our Backs.
Stephen, did you have a very quick one?
Yeah, if I can. So you talked about religion on a number of occasions, and you were also mentioning earlier on the relationship between the kind of writing you're looking at and the canon generally. And I'm thinking about the ways in which male prison writing actually locks into the canon. I mean, John Mitchell mentioned, I think about Oscar Wilde, just weirdness to the trilogy, Ian Paisley. These are all people who look back, particularly through Bunyan, to biblical moments, and use that as a way of narrativizing their experience of prison in many different kinds of ways. And I just wondered if any of the women that you were looking at had any similar ways into a kind of religious tradition on which they can model their experience or use it.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for the question, and also thinking kind of through that historical preface is useful. Yeah, I mean, there's a number of writers. I think most of the writers in this study are religious, not all of them, but I think the most religious writer in the text is Roseleen Walsh. She's very, very devout Catholic, goes to church every day, prays, and I think her writing is inextricably bound up with her writing and her social justice and her charity and all the things that she does. And she's written a number of religious poems in particular and spiritual booklets. You might find her writing really interesting. But for many of the women, yeah, their religion was a part of their life through their prayer and through doing the rosary among other things. And I think it reflected a sense of identity and a sense of culture for them. And some of the women were Catholic kind of culturally and politically, but not religiously. And, I'm thinking of like certain women, and like there's a quote in Síle Darragh's memoir. It's like, I never read the Bible, but I smoked it, So like there's that type of prisoner. So, but yeah, I think most of the women were religious, and some more than others, but Roseleen Walsh was definitely the most religious.
Okay, thank you all very much. And just a reminder, Red's book is Irish Women's Prison Writing, Mother Ireland's Rebels, 1960s to 2010s. It is, as unfortunately is the case with so many of these important books, priced beyond the reach of mere mortals. But we hope to get it into the library in Queens very soon. So if anyone wants to follow up on what Red's been speaking about tonight, the book will be available within the near future. So I think it just falls to me to thank Red for coming from CUNY. I know you have a number of other appointments here in Belfast, but thank you for coming and speaking to us here in Queens. It's been a really interesting session.